All right. Welcome back to the Protocol Town Hall, a periodic guest talk series focused on protocols and protocol research. Today, we will be speaking with Yancey Strickler about his dive down the crypto rabbit hole and some of the lessons that came from that. There is a link to forum.summerprotocols.com in which any conversation that we will be having will be hosted in this forum link. So look for that shortly. Our next town hall will be with researcher Kia Krutler on her research project from the summer on memory. You can find more about summer protocols, the research, the program calendar, and how to get a protocol kit at summerprotocols.com. And with that, I will hand it off to Venkat to introduce our guest speaker today.
All right. So welcome, everybody. And I'm really excited about this talk. I started chanting with Yancey, I think a couple of years ago when he started putting together this anthology of essays that I think he's going to mention as an example of his new venture. So I'll leave him to actually describe what he roped me into. But yeah, I think I first noticed your name somewhere on my email subscriber list several years ago. And I was like, cool, the co-founder of Kickstarter is reading my newsletter. So always a little boost when you realize you're being read in influential places, let's put it that way. But yeah, of course, Yancey is well known as the co-founder of Kickstarter, and he quit that a couple of years ago, and I think spent a couple of years in the wild writing a book, and I think that was part of this journey of transformation he's going to talk about. And now he's doing this thing, Metalabel, which is a new publishing venture with some really interesting characteristics. And along the way, he's learned some very interesting and I would say tough lessons about building with crypto technologies and sort of some of the hard conversations that I think the crypto world especially should be having and often tries to avoid. And I think it's really important that we actually have these conversations, honestly. So really looking forward to that part. And before handing it over to Yancey, I do want to quickly mention the protocol kits that Josh mentioned. They've just started shipping, and I got mine last week. So this huge fat binder. So really excited about that. So if you're interested, go to summerprotocols.com/kit, and you can snag one of the remaining ones if you want to go deep on protocols. With that, over to you, Yancey.
I love that package was like a mid-90s software release. I can't wait for mine. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully that's cool. All right. Well, just thank you so much to Venkat for having me. I see friends in the room. I've been following this project from the beginning and feel a great intellectual kinship. So just to be invited to share my ideas, I'm very appreciative. I'm going to detail the journey that Metalabel has been on for the past 2 years. It's a journey that's really been about the tensions between technological determinism, human experience, and what happens when the means justify the ends. I've broken this talk into 5 sections where I share our experiences and some of the conclusions we came to. And I want to stress at the top that our experiences, our values, our decisions are our own. Some of you probably will disagree with some of the things I say, which is great. I think what's most important is that all projects go through a process of really trying to understand what they're trying to do, and then make sure the technologies and decisions they make are really lined up to get them there. The story starts 7 years ago. I'd stepped down as the CEO of Kickstarter, and I was writing a book called This Could Be Our Future. The book introduced a new framework for thinking about self-interest called bentoism, which I soon started teaching in people's living rooms and in workshops online. As is always the case with community management, building and supporting the bento society, as it was called, took a lot of energy. I was constantly creating content, hosting spaces. This was something I chose to do and really loved, but at the same time, it was quite draining. I was constantly giving, but what I was receiving wasn't always easy to tell. And eventually, I hit a point of burnout, and I hit pause on everything to try to figure out what I should do. And to clear my head, I just started reading a lot. And there are a couple of things in particular that really spoke to what I was experiencing. The first was a book called Our Band Could Be Your Life that tells the story of how punk and hardcore began in the US. It focuses on Sonic Youth, Black Flag, Meat Puppets, groups of kids or young people who would start really noisy bands, and then they would record music that they'd want to put out, but no record label, which was still required back then, was willing to work with them. So instead, they had to start their own labels to be heard. Now, to start their own label was just a matter of a name, a logo, and an address, and then they could begin self-publishing themselves. But there was something special that happened whenever a band would start their own label. It invited other people to follow in their footsteps. The act of putting out their music was also an act of manifesting whatever it is they stood for. To put out a punk record manifested more punkness in the world. And the label represented the vehicle by which listeners found that, and it also represented a path that they could also do the same. So putting out a record would inspire other people to want to follow in that footsteps. Releasing was an act of manifesting. The second thing I read that really stood out was about the history of a group called the Royal Society. The Royal Society started in 1660 in London as a club of academics who believed that facts should be determined by evidence rather than by the decree of the church or the king. They started meeting every week in a pub to talk about these ideas and just to explore what views they held in common. Eventually, they decided to try to manifest or express their beliefs, and they began publishing a journal called Philosophical Transactions, which was the first zine. And this zine would go on to feature the writings of Isaac Newton. It's where Benjamin Franklin published his kite experiment. And they also started funding projects too. They funded the creation of the first microscope. They funded the making of the Babbage machine. And ever since 1660, the Royal Society has continued to iteratively publish and support work that aligned with their views of facts through evidence. And through it, they created the scientific method, peer review, and modern science as we know it. Now, punk bands and a group of Victorian academics couldn't seem more different. But what I felt in that moment 5 years ago was that in both cases, it was a small group of people who shared a common worldview, who agreed to co-release work that expressed their values. I first called this structure a culture label, that the same model could work not just in music or fashion, where we know the label concept, but it could apply to any form of output. And so this same form could be used for groups of disparate people to come together and release work. My initial instinct was to try to see myself as a label. So I went through my own catalog of things I've made, and I actually saw themes, consistent collaborators, thematic through lines that I hadn't really noticed before. And seeing myself as a label was a breakthrough. It showed me my work in a larger context. So I started looking for a solution online where I could build a label and express my work, create a catalog the way that I saw it. So I tried using Squarespace, Cargo, Wix, but I quickly found that all were terrible at treating my data with any kind of care. It was just CSS and HTML and a template. There's nothing durable, no knowledge of what it represented, no sense of real architecture. And these were also sites that wouldn't create a legacy that could outlive me. The second I stopped paying them $150 a year or whatever, everything I'd done would just be taken offline. So I put this concept on the back burner and started exploring some other projects, but this observation just kept simmering. And at one point, while talking with a friend, a new word appeared to describe this concept. This concept, the structure, could be called a metalabel. As I started searching for how to create a more durable catalog and a label, it led me to the blockchain. It was 2021. Crypto was the intellectual rage. The idea of permanent storage solutions, collective governance, payment splits, interoperable data, artist royalties, that's all felt like the core underpinnings of the type of architecture I wanted to create, not just for me, but for other people too. I'd first been interested in blockchains while researching my book, which called out how society had come to see financial value as the only value worth making decisions on. And I tried to imagine how a wider spectrum of values could compete against finances in swaying our judgment. And there's one practical example of a shifting metric system that I wrote about in the book that didn't involve blockchains, but felt spiritually related. Whenever the pop star Adele goes on tour, her tickets immediately sell out and go on secondary markets where the prices are inflated by hundreds or even thousands of %. But back in 2015, Adele experimented with a loyalty score based on people's social and listening history to determine who the most deserving Adele fan was and then distribute the tickets to them. Using this algorithmic means of distributing, the experiment was a success, where less than 10% of these tickets got resold on secondary markets, despite there being no restrictions. And that saved her fans hundreds of thousands of dollars across this tour. And it let Adele play for the most loyal fans, the people that she most wished to perform for. And this idea of an individual having the agency to change the metric that would allow people to have access to whatever they were doing felt to me like a very exciting revelation. And if we could pinpoint other metrics beyond finances, then a whole new world of decision-making could open up. And especially with blockchains, where it's possible to turn basically any numerical value into some sort of gating mechanism. And you could ascribe that into a smart contract and protect those values, that way of thinking for the future. So I started getting more and more excited about blockchains and how they could serve this label infrastructure. And during this time, the Metalabel project began to gather momentum. And in March 2022, we first introduced the initial expression of Metalabel with a series called Quality Drops, where we let groups of creators sell bundles of work, things like zines, books, art, concerts, film screenings, vinyl, white papers, by groups of people working together, with all transactions happening via crypto and blockchains. But starting with the very first drop, things got a little weird. In that drop, Gitcoin reissued the original quadratic funding white paper by Vitalik Buterin, Glenn Weil, and Zoe Hitzig as a collectible fundraiser. The project raised about $250,000 in 6 days of funding, but in the very last hours before the drop closed, there was this sudden frenzy as people on Twitter were talking about this as being Vitalik's first ever NFT drop. And suddenly the release became not this cozy fundraiser about an esoteric white paper, but instead got overtaken by a new narrative. The creators of the release, as well as Metalabel, we started getting flooded with messages demanding we do certain things to drive the value of this even higher. The original context of the work was pulled out. And there was a tweet that really embodied the moment, where someone on Twitter wrote to Metalabel saying, "I own 3 and I don't know why?" ? It just went off the rails. Now, earlier in the crypto boom, artists and creators could benefit from these speculation frenzies through royalties, where they would typically receive 10% of proceeds if their work was resold. But in late 2022, a new NFT platform called Blur found a way to negate this requirement that artists get royalties when their art is sold. And they did this to attract more of the collector audience, who were wooed by the idea of not having to pay an extra 10% to a pesky artist while flipping NFTs. And this move worked. Blur quickly built a substantial audience with traders and a lot of market power. And by that point, OpenSea, which was fearing losing business, changed its policies to match. And Blur then told creators that Blur would sometimes honor artist royalties. OpenSea did the same, but only if the artist blocked their work from being sold elsewhere. And just within months of this, artist royalties, which have been the most promising new creator income stream since crowdfunding, was on life support. Now, just to underscore how wild this is from my perspective, imagine if Spotify said we will no longer pay artist royalties on music, and thus our service is free. Then as they use that underpricing to grow market share, then they might say to an artist, okay, well, we will pay you royalty, but only if you delete your music from other services. This dynamic would be about as anti-creator and anti-user as you could possibly imagine. Now, last year, Spotify did announce it would no longer pay royalties on tracks that get less than 1,000 plays. And if this had played out like the Blur OpenSea battle, Spotify would have then told artists, well, you can get royalties if you block your music from being sold elsewhere. But that didn't happen because each of these music services are sufficiently independent. They could each make choices of their own. There wasn't this trigger mechanism that could control what goes where in such a way. Now, that Gitcoin drop and then subsequent frenzy was the first strike we felt against crypto, but there were a couple others that hit as well. About a month later, we had another release scheduled, this time for an art book from Japan by two artists who had no connections to crypto. But the same week we planned to put out this, a meme coin called Pepe went wild on Ethereum, driving up gas prices to the extent that would have cost more than $100 to buy a $30 book. As a business looking to deliver a reliable service to creative people, this was devastating. If they couldn't trust, and if we couldn't trust the basic infrastructure to process payments, how are any of us supposed to make a living or actually do this? If we're so dependent on this wider market, it removes our agency as individual creators. So Metalabel, we pivoted and we added a Stripe commerce option to all future drops. We had a sort of a fallback we could always point to, and we started to integrate Metalabel more into the traditional financial system, where at least we could rely on things to work dependably as promised. And then a few weeks later, there was a third strike when my wallet was drained via a fake blue check account on Twitter. I'd always been security conscious, and yet here I was after just a very simple lapse. I got a call from law enforcement, not afterwards, to explain they found the suspect, someone in New Jersey, but they were unable to get back what had been stolen because it had already been resold and blockchains didn't allow for reversing transactions, and there was nothing that they or I could do. In that moment, all I could think about was how a creator might have felt, maybe someone who had used Metalabel, and whether it might have been the degen community putting pressure on them to try to drive up the financial value of something they'd made, or if someone had gotten drained without any hope of recourse, and they would still have to pay taxes on it if it had come in as income. It was one thing for me, or one thing for us as a business to deal with this, but what about an individual? What about a future customer? And so our doubts about crypto really started to grow. These events prompted a series of conversations within Metalabel about our dependence on blockchains. When we went back to the original ideas that sparked the project, culture labels, punk rock, Royal Society, crypto blockchains were nowhere in the picture. Were we really sure that they needed to be now? We felt stuck between the promise and the reality of crypto. So I decided to go on a crypto diet. I decided that I would consciously limit my exposure to crypto dogma and just try to sort out internally what I thought was important. So I unfollowed crypto accounts on social media. I changed my information diet. I went on a crypto cleanse. And the experience was revealing. Whereas before, crypto had felt like this inevitable fait accompli, while in the bubble of blockchains, once I stopped looking at Twitter, I never heard a single person talk about crypto. It existed in this one corner and seemingly nowhere else. I encouraged my fellow squad mates to go through a similar process of giving their feeds a crypto diet to see what they found. And we all felt similar revelations. Getting the world on chain felt hollow once we actually were taking in the world at large. Some friends in the space heard about our experience and asked what we had done. So we wrote a piece detailing our steps to decrypto ourselves in terms of our information diet, and we shared this Google Doc privately with other people. We didn't want to publicly critique crypto because we were still sorting out what we thought, but we did think being honest about our experiences had value in private, where we've always found people are more willing to be critical and ask harder questions. And this Google Doc called Climbing Out of the Rabbit Hole now has more than 100 comments of people either agreeing with us or arguing against it as this is circulated in private group chats. So with this added space of climbing out of the rabbit hole, we looked at our project with fresh eyes. And if we stepped back and asked ourselves, what were we really trying to do? What were the things that stood out? And what we wanted to build was actually pretty clear. We wanted to create an infrastructure for groups of people to release work together and to sell that work. We wanted to have infrastructure for people to have shared financial outcomes. We wanted an open system that let the work made on Metalabel flow freely around the web, whether that's a catalog of work or a group's identity. And we wanted to have a platform that really tried to imbue creative work with more value so that people felt like it was worth paying for. Most of these functions were things that were possible with blockchains, but the breathing room let us think more about not a specific playbook we were using, but rather these ends that we were trying to reach instead of the means we were using to get there. And seeing it that way was an unlock, because in contrast, crypto and blockchains was a path where the means justified the ends. What matters is less the end user experience than the fact that the data is stored and written in a specific structure. It's the means that matter more than ends. And because the means justify the ends in crypto, there's certain consequences that come with the territory that are extremely difficult to change and are extremely hard for a general public. But those of us in the space have simply accepted because the means force us to. So for example, security is a huge problem in crypto because blockchains can't roll back. We call this being permissionless and say code is law, but in reality, it's a hostile consumer experience where people's personal property is easily stolen without any recourse because of just the technical construction of blockchains. There's also a de facto potential for financialization built into everything because it was a financial application that first drove blockchain's creation. So any piece of content can be wildly financialized without its creators benefiting or giving approval because of the open nature of these systems. And because blockchain space is so limited, people have to pay micro fees and transactions to do anything. We've rebranded these fees as protocol rewards or referral bonuses, but from a consumer perspective, they're just service fees like Ticketmaster. But in crypto, we accept them because the means justify the ends. Now, in all these cases, the means outweigh the ends for the true believers, but for people outside the space, it's the ends that matter, which is part of what makes crypto feel so hostile and unwelcoming. Now, blockchains aren't the only example of means justifying the ends. Organic food is a good example of a product category built around the means rather than the ends. As a result of those means, organic food is theoretically healthier, tastier, worth paying more money for. Handmade is, say, another category where the means are more important than the ends, and they imply a certain outcome that a purchaser will understand and be familiar with. I see Mastodon and Blue Sky, both built so much on the promise of decentralization, are also means rather than ends focus. But so long as that is their dominant goal, I think both services are limited in the relevance to the wants and desires of the general public. So when we stepped back and looked at the end user experience we wanted to provide, we discovered that we could create the service exactly like we envisioned, while also allowing our customers to use existing tools and financial rails that they were already comfortable with. Our journey into the rabbit hole and back out created something unique, a product stack that's very much inspired by crypto, but has zero blockchains underneath it. There's a couple weeks ago, Venkatesh wrote a great post called Brains, Trains, and Vibesmobiles that I thought showed a similar line of thinking. Venkatesh takes the concept of the three major forms of transportation, planes, trains, and automobiles, and uses them as a metaphor for three major paradigms of human technical computing activity. Planes are equivalent to the brains of elites who are managing systems. Those might be human brains, they might increasingly be AI brains. Trains are blockchains, these very specific rails that can provide an infrastructure layer that can efficiently move goods in large quantities from one area to another. And there's a third core category of automobiles, which Venkat calls vibesmobiles. These more bespoke end parts of the experience of how actual people get around and do the things that they need to do. They're more nimble and more bespoke. I would put Metalabel in this vibesmobile category. We're a last mile experience that is constructed to support human agency and the many bespoke desires more than mass efficiency. It's thinking about the individual and what groups of individuals need. So if I think about the stack that we're using to operate this, we're using an architecture that we believe can deliver a post-platform and sovereign experience. And its core components are first an operating system that allows multiplayer creativity, groups of people to align around work, to publish and sell work together. It has a redesign of existing payments architecture that allows for shared financial outcomes among these groups. We have a very opinionated data architecture that preserves creative work as a catalog raisonné that's very open and exportable. So if you think about what I was looking for in Squarespace, Argo and Wix way back when, this is that structure that I wanted. We've built the system so that all identities, both data and people in our system, are decentralized identifiers that empower the creators to own, control, and manage their identities. We're issuing our own centralized, decentralized identifiers, but these are portable and trustless. And we're set up to support people bringing their own identities in the future, like Blue Sky, Privy, or things on chain. To help establish authorship, we're using cryptographically signed data that will let people prove their identity, that their work is theirs. And this can be validated without Metalabel servers. It can be validated even offline because you have the public and private key structure. And finally, everything in Metalabel uses open APIs, open data schemas, and public access at its core. Now, not all these things will be built out to their fullest extent when this turns on very soon, but the entire system is architected to allow this sort of open nature, a very crypto-like way of thinking about what a product should be. Now, most of these are already well-established standards that we're just taking advantage of. Others, like decentralized identifiers or some of the financial innovations we're going to introduce, are newer and we think very promising. This tech stack lets us provide a predictable user experience. Nothing's going to feel weird or off, but while also allowing for a very different type of outcome than the Web 2 platforms we're used to. And because it's architected to be so open, it's very easy for us to integrate other pipes and services if and when we choose. With the stack, it's also the case that if Metalabel were to go out of business, these catalogs and identities will be able to live on with the same levels of authority and integrity, even without Metalabel servers, because of this underlying infrastructure. So the way I think of this is that this stack that we've created, this Vibesmobile, is simply a new option for that last mile for how it is that we as individuals and groups are sharing money, ideas, and creative work. It's trying to take the things that we're most inspired by the other main channels of how things move around, and just designing something that fits this very specific use case. It's really through our legacy of going through the crypto rabbit hole that we're able to see the value of these things and try to create something that really fulfilled on them. Now, when Metalabel launches next week, we're not going to emphasize these post-platform functions. Instead, we're just going to talk about what creators can do with them. They can publish and catalog creative work. They could start groups with others. They can share resources. It's the end result that matters, and the means are just the fine print. And underlying all of this is this reimagining of the label structure. The platform will let groups of creators come together to co-release work in ways that we haven't been able to previously. The very first release is a case in point. It's a book by myself, by Venkat, Maggie Appleton, Peter Lindbergh, and Rebecca Fox of the Stoa, Joshua Citarella and Laith Benkata from Do Not Research, Arthur Rowan Bear and GVN 908 from Trust, and Caroline Busta and Little Internet of New Models. We've come together to make a book called The Dark Forest Anthology of the Internet that brings each of our individual works into something larger than any of us on our own. More releases are going to follow on a curated weekly basis. We're very excited about the type of work that we're going to be putting into the world. In many aspects of this experience, we're heavily inspired by crypto, open interoperable data, portable identities, provenance, shared financial rails. The influence of crypto on this is considerable. We're translating what we find most compelling into what we think our customers as creative people will want and use. This is what was so inspiring to me about what Adele did with her ticketing algorithm. You know, here I was as a writer swimming in a theory about what would happen if value systems changed. And then here was an artist who had a reason to find a way to do that. not because of some philosophical or theoretical concept, because that's what she urgently needed for her work to feel right, to match her values and sense of what was important. Our search for peer relationships with other creative people comes from the same place. Our own experiences as lonely creators trapped in the creator economy lit a fire that made us want a new context, a new type of experience. The old ways weren't working, and we wanted something new. The design space of crypto opened up a new path, even as we've chosen not to fully adopt its plumbing for now. Our goal is to serve people and to provide a better outcome than the status quo. And this is how we feel we can do that. It's the ends, not the means, that really count. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Yancey, for that. Questions or comments for Yancey? Venkat, you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to kick off and sort of head off some of the obvious lines of conversation that I think are dull, because this is one of those talks on the edge between two extremely polarized sort of like reactions that I think are natural. One is like avid crypto fans are going to immediately jump up and sort of like have this defensive reaction of, oh, but we've solved all your problems, and Optimism and Zora are doing blah, 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 and all your problems are solved, come back, right? On the other hand, there's this sort of like knee-jerk, virulently anti-crypto crowd, and a lot of them live on Mastodon, who are going to be like very gleeful, as in like, oh, this proves my case all along, burn it all down, right? And I think both are uninteresting lines of conversation. And really, I think, yeah, the metaphor of trains versus automobiles works really well for me. And another idea we've been thinking about, so Tim and I and some of the rest of us, is really protocols are a bigger category than blockchains. And there's this sort of like 30, 40-year movement towards protocolization of the world, where all the infrastructure of like the centralized industrial worlds, like, you know, mainframe computers as the motif of that, started getting protocolized. And it's a much bigger thing than just blockchains. And I think it's like comparable to urbanization, and all of us as humans have to kind of learn a new literacy to live in this environment. And many of these literacies are common across, you know, whether you're riding trains or automobiles. It's like, you know, public-private key pairs. That's a literacy everybody needs to acquire. Understanding decentralized networks of nodes as the back end of infrastructure, as opposed to centralized monolithic platforms. That's kind of like a literacy and mental model people need. So yeah, I think that there's this whole increasing protocol literacy floats all boats, whether they're trains or automobiles. I'm like completely mixing my metaphors here, but that's kind of like just wanted to throw that out there as a framing thought, like avoid the immediate knee-jerk yes or no kind of reaction and look for other interesting threads to pull on here.
Yeah, just to comment on that, I mean, I think protocols are eating the world, right? And yeah, I think you're right. We might end up in the uncanny valley of everybody hates it, which is I don't know how to feel about that, but you know, I think it was crypto and blockchains that I think put a protocol way of thinking and design, made that more front and center and allowed us to think about that structure. I mean, even you could argue Kickstarter and crowdfunding is a protocol. We thought of it as a business model back then. And yeah, I mean, I think that yeah, I lost my train of thought, but yes.
Dorian?
Hey, you got me thinking about the Adele example, about how like just registering some kind of qualitative yet still measurable thing, I guess, and having that be currency in addition to the actual currency. So kind of almost like a package in the exchange that is denominated in more than one type of thing, which I think is kind of interesting. But is that represented in Metalabel at all? Like, or is that like just kind of an analogous riff? Like, are you trying to represent that kind of thing, like, the artist only gets, the people who, the artist can stipulate that the people who really want the art are the ones that get it, kind of thing?
It is not in the initial product structure, but I think an analogous thing in crypto is like if people who hold this thing in their wallet can get this other thing, there will be similar sorts of things that are possible. But yeah, I mean, I had a long time in the maze of how could you create new metrics, and came to think of value as a spectrum of like value singular economic word, meaning hard numbers, values plural humanistic word, meaning goals and ideals, and that a values plural could become a value singular if measured, if you sort of move it along that line. Now, when you do that, there's a lot of danger. It's going to be imprecise. We know all the reasons why metrics can be challenging.
Good hearts.
So I spent a lot of time in that world. Yeah, exactly. And ended up, lost interest in that. But I think that, that has continued to be something I've been excited about for what blockchains can do of just, what is a transaction is something that you can ask quite differently, I think, in that kind of scale, that kind of situation.
The hardness quotient, I guess.
Yeah.
Other questions or comments for Yancey? David?
You're muted, David.
Oh, hey, Yancey.
Hey, what's up?
One of the things that I've always admired about you and your career is, you've brought like money and commerce into these places where it's kind of taboo, like, creativity and art and creative projects. And you've done a good job protecting the spirit and the soul of those works. And so I'm wondering, you talked a lot about the kind of the journey and the mechanics and the tech stack, but I'm wondering what are some of the rails you're putting in place to protect the soul and the spirit of these collaborative and creative endeavors.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a romantic, and I feel like we hate labels now because we see them as giant extractors of value that are inherently unfair. And I think they all started off as generally like grassroots things that at a certain scale, there's the private equity business logic that takes over and sort of destroys that. So on the one hand, I think it starts with just how do you let more grassroots labels and creative organizations start? Like I fundamentally think Metalabel is going to create a new type of creative organization at a mass scale. Like I think it is very hard for a group of creative people to collaborate today. We're going to make that very simple by giving them an operating system to do it. And then we ourselves are going to be very opinionated as a platform. So for example, won't be this initially, but with time, when you're creating a release or a label's putting something out, there is an agreement made between the label and the creators of that will define the economics of that release. We will also allow that contract to define ownership, or what is the exact license. And there will create a drop down of options, all of which we see as being neutral to beneficial for the individual creator. Like the Universal Music Group style deal will not be an option in Metalabel. Maybe people can do it offline, but we'll try to conform everything to it's egalitarian. Things are default to artists owning their work in most cases, and just trying to remove the most extractive options from the table. I fully expect if a label starting on our platform gets big, they'll exit, they'll enter the trad economy and whatever. They might end up being all the things that we don't like, but I think as much as possible, you just try to normalize pro-social values and expectations and just make those the easiest steps to take. and just hope that creates a culture that, creates social pressure, expectations, all those things around it.
Awesome. Thank you. Timber, question?
Hey, I recently read this book by Carl Weick, and he talks about how people gather around means first, so like common means before diverging and finding separate means of doing something, and then finally converging again on a convergent end goal. Do you feel like this is just kind of this first stage in the cycle where a bunch of people got together around a common means, which is crypto, and got like way too obsessive about that, and now there's this branching off of people that are like, okay, this is just a tool that we can use to find new, better end states for the world, and we'll focus on achieving that now with crypto as just one piece of the toolkit?
Yeah, there's a metaphor that I use in the climbing out of the rabbit hole piece that says that crypto is a bad major, but it's a great minor. Like majoring in crypto means it's means obsessed, just all about the tech, all about the tech. Now, clearly some people need to do that. We need Trent to do that. Like that is a category of person. But for most of us, like crypto as a minor, something that is in service of a larger goal, I think is going to produce a far better outcome. But like crypto as a major is why crypto is like has Fox News brain of just speaking in like these metaphors and concepts that are just alien to anyone outside the bubble, and it's so limiting. But if we can just maybe shift to crypto or blockchains or just even protocols or any of these things in service of something, I think that's where you begin to see not even people caring, but just people using, people enjoying the benefits of these things. So yeah, I think that's on point.
I got another question.
Muted.
You're muted.
Venkat.
Oh yeah. So this is related to the book we're doing together. Thought I'd chill that too a little bit, but I think it's very relevant here. The idea of the dark forest, right? It's been very influential in the design of crypto architectures. A lot of people building crypto think of the environment as dark forest, as in you do anything at all that's slightly visible, and if there's a way to like turn it into a hostile attack surface, there will be enough people to do that. And the more I've thought about that since you wrote your essay, the more it seems to me, I've been using this phrase now that the dark forest rules everything around me. Like just a couple of days ago, I was on a call about like, just the traditional internet and just the amount of defensive dark forest perimeter management that regular website owners have to do. Like even if you run a completely minor blog that you think nobody but your mom reads, chances are that it's under attack by like hundreds of random attacks, state actors, and so forth. And one of the interesting things about what you're doing with the labels, I think, is it sounds like labels are a way to retain optimism without denying the dark forest nature of the world. Because a lot of like idealism strikes me as, can we make people better? Can we make everybody have like positive, optimistic, win-win vibes? And I think that's fundamentally a delusional way of approaching the matter. I think fundamentally we do live in a dark forest universe, and the trick is to see what mechanisms allow you to survive the dark forest without getting eaten alive by it. And I think there's a game theory metaphor here, or maybe it's actually a model here of like you guys are familiar with the iterated prisoner's dilemma, right? Like you cooperate, and that creates win-win outcomes. If either party defects, you create like a negative sum outcome. And one of the research results is that if you have a large group where most people are like default defectors, so basically a dark forest, the only way to like start building value is to identify other cooperators. So if you have a small group of people that is cooperating with each other and most of their transactions are with each other, then you solve the iterated prisoner's dilemma. And part of this is, of course, you shouldn't be sucked into transactions with the defectors at all. So that's staying silent in the dark forest. But yeah, is this a fair way to think of it? Are labels and meta labels a way to stay optimistic in a dark forest assumption of the world?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think as one of the pieces in our book is Moving Castles by Trust, which is a great metaphor for how a group of people can have a private space that they use to influence public space. So you have your private conspiratorial zone, but then you have your feeds where you're pushing out ideas that the group comes up with in their Telegram or their Discord. And I think that is a great kind of structure that makes a lot of sense. I'm also pessimistic about governance of large scale organizations and groups. Maybe pessimistic is the wrong word, uninspired. To me, a group of a dozen people or less where everyone is a principal, everyone has true decision-making power, everyone has, Metalabel is a hierarchy, a fluid hierarchy where each have different domains where we're empowered to make decisions. But like that, I think is the most personally meaningful, the most creatively meaningful, socially meaningful type of experience, or those smaller pockets. And to me, allowing people to be a member of a lot of those tribes is the answer. You know, I see a label as not monogamous, it is polyamorous. I think we'll all belong to many different types of groups that speak to different aspects of who we are, and other places where we can conspire on certain topics or other topics, and they just afford us that there's like the protection of the group identity, there's the protection of bouncing ideas off of other people. To me, it's the inverse of all of us as creators trying to get as many subscribers as possible. You know, I think like the value, you can measure individualism by how many followers you have. The book we have coming out, I introduce a concept of post-individualism, and I think the value of post-individualism is like, who are you in a group chat with? That is the value of 2020s in the future.
Awesome. Trent, question?
Yeah, to ask a follow-on to that, do you think there's a fundamental limit in human nature or something that suggests like groups of 12 or whatever your definition of small groups is best for these types of intimate, hierarchical organizations, or ones that have, you know, all rights and obligations are distributed to all members? Is that just a number that feels right, or probably in your experience you have some things that are informing this, or is there some other thing that informs this number? Like, what's the max height you think you can get to with these types of groups?
Yeah, I'm all this is spitballing, but in the early days of Kickstarter, I read this white paper by Jeffrey West, and he talked about how there's a golden ratio in biology, where if you tell someone the weight of an animal, you can say, here's how long its gestation period is, here's how much it eats every day, here's its lifespan. Just based on one metric, you can determine all these things about it. And he applied the golden ratio to human systems. He applied them to cities and found if you gave him the number of people in a city, he could tell you how many gas stations there were, how many hospitals, and vice versa. There was similarly this kind of ratio that seemed consistent. And then he tried to explore organizations from the same lens. And he has this concept what he finds is that organizations, unlike cities, are organic life forms. And by organic life forms, he means they are born, they mature, and they ultimately die. And his analysis suggested that the point at which a company matures is 50 people. And by definition, the moment you mature, you are beginning to die in the way he sees it. And the reason why that 50 number happens is because when an organization gets to 50 people, it begins to hire operational and administrative support that exists to support the needs of the organization itself rather than the purpose of the organization. And as soon as you begin to add the operational layer, you have to increase your growth rate faster, your business growth rate faster than your internal growth rate to not die. And that once you hit that number, that race creates all sorts of secondary outcomes that are just very challenging. And when I read that at Kickstarter, I think we were like maybe 20 people then. And my co-founders, Perry and Charles, and I, we sat in a room and wrote on the whiteboard, okay, here's the last 30 hires we're going to ever make. Kickstarter will never be more than 50 people. And we followed that plan for like a few months. And then Kickstarter became mainstream news, and suddenly we were waking up to like 1,000 support tickets, and it's like, no way, like forget it. And looking back, I don't think that was the right call. I think that if we had made the decision to say, no, actually, we must conform the business reality to what we can support as this group of people, I think that might have generated a better outcome. I mean, I think that's kind of the Craigslist story in a way, how Craig has managed that. So I think there is some truism there. I can't defend it with my full confidence, but I think there is something to that.
Sorry, maybe I missed the last part. You said you should have kept it at 50. You should have kept
Yeah,
Kickstarter
I think
at 50.
so.
Okay.
I think so. So for Metalabel, our concept is, again, we'll see. If we succeed, if we fail, all of our structures work great. If we succeed, they become challenged. But the way we think of it is that we have partners. So those are people who are core decision makers. We imagine there's like a max of roughly 12 partners. And then we have associates who are people who also have a lot of influence, but aren't exactly in the same hierarchical level. And we're trying to keep the team small. We're currently 8 people. But again, if we have that moment of like our support queues are going crazy, I mean, maybe we can just use AI to solve that now. But I think as you grow in people, you conform to the mean, and the mean is going to be more conservative. And it's just I view that entropic force of organizations as something that is way more powerful than me. And so I have to like create tricks and structures and all these things to try to hold it at bay, because it will destroy us on any given day if you don't consciously push against it. And I'm just humbled by how powerful those things are. And this is my latest attempt to try to counterbalance them.
Yeah. One thing that comes to mind for the project I work on, Protocol Guild, is I like to say we have we have a budget for contention, or like a budget for conflict, and every time you have to make a decision, you're subtracting from that budget, and it only replenishes over time. And so we're at 167 people right now. Obviously very different from some of the stuff you're working on, and we have some affordances that come from how we structure it. But yeah, I definitely feel we bump up into we're like, it's getting closer and closer to our capacity for decision making and what kinds of decisions you can make at this scale. One last thing, you said if our structures fail, then we succeed. What was that line again? Can you say that again?
Well, just like being a small team works great if it doesn't grow that much, like there's not a lot of pressure. But in an instance of a huge demand, then a lot of these choices of the more bespoke experience become challenged, just because there is maybe a mismatch of demand for resources to resources you can give. But again, I look at Craigslist as an example where Craigslist makes a decision of like, you know what, we're not going to moderate beyond the extremes because we don't want to have a 300-person trust and safety team, because that's going to suck. That's going to destroy the vibe, and I think that is a very mature decision that is not appreciated, I think, for really what it means and all the outcomes and benefits that come from, say, that type of design choice.
Got it. Appreciate it.
Dorian, another question from you.
Have that Zoom on. Yancey, you said something interesting about contracts, and I was wondering if you could expand on that. Like, it's occurred to me, for instance, that in the past, that one of the sort of real benefits of the open source licenses and the to a lesser extent the open source licenses, because I think they're a little bit more opaque, but say Creative Commons, how you've got this the actual documents themselves are considerably longer, but you've got this, like, it's just a logo, or a suite of logos that are like, this bit flipped, this bit flipped, this bit flipped a certain way, and then you've got the, however many positions that the of the bits being flipped. and everybody understands what that means. And so I'm assuming you've sort of taken that a page from that manual, and trying to create these. And so like I'm wondering is like to what extent do you have like a suite of contracts where it is a bit that you flip and there's like, you know, a visual language attached to that even potentially, if you can speak to that at all.
Yeah, I mean, shout out CC, which is, you know, I think criminally underappreciated for how much, you know, intellectual heft and benefit is baked into that. You're thinking about it better than I am in terms of a product experience. I think that's a great way to think about it. Our contracts to start are going to be just around financial outcomes, and then we will layer in other aspects of like things entering the public domain or things having specific structures or agreements. If I think about like the record label world, some of my favorite labels like Discord Records or Touch and Go, they pioneered a deal way back in the day that was anything they put out, it's a 50-50 split. Artist owns all masters and royalties, and it's a handshake deal. There's no paperwork, handshake, 50-50, you own it. And like that is to me, that is a great sort of poll of like, what is one form of a fair deal look like? We're going to push people more towards a default of like 30% of money goes to a label, 70 goes to the artist, but that is fully changeable by in any sort of release. But there is that concept of how should things flow? What should the outcomes of this be? All of that is a design space that people can play with, and it will get more sophisticated with time.
Absolutely. I'm one of the things I've been toying with myself is a service contract archetype for effectively for consulting work, and trying to figure out like how to basically CC that. I have like that is like, you know, under a pile of other things, but I'm using it. I have used it with clients and whatnot, but it would be very interesting, for example, for creative professionals to have an analogous thing to a license, but in this case, it would be a contract that, you know, had the same sort of like, maybe there's like 6 bits to flip, maybe there's a slider on the partitioning of the proceeds, et cetera, you know, but there is a sort of reduced footprint of the things that you need to understand, you know, analogous to the CC, where it's like, yeah, there's 3 things that you have to care about, whether it's this, that, or the other thing. You know, doesn't matter what it is at the moment, but yeah, it's the same sort of thing. And then it's like stamp like logos on like what those are. And so you just have it in the corner. This is the deal. And it's just, you know, the fine print has been figured out. Everybody understands it. And then can sort of reduce the thicket of opaque legalese that is really not very necessary, because there really is only a handful of variables.
Contracts are a weapon of, you know, organizations against individuals, and so how do you neutralize that? And I think this is a way.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, sort of analogously to the you know, sort of spirit of blockchain, it's kind of like or, you know, and even stuff like democracy, it's like, you know, it's once the public knows that they can have this thing, like they're never gonna take a inferior deal to that.
Awesome. Thanks so much, everybody. I'll maybe open it up for one last final thought if anyone's got a last minute question or comment. But I'd like to respect Yancey's time here, and yeah, Tim, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. This was excellent, and I really enjoyed reading your Google Docs a couple of weeks ago. So really appreciate it. Oh, sorry, Zoom was sending me a weird notice. So I work on blockchain. It's my major. What's something like Ethereum or the crypto space could do to frame it more as a means to most people rather than an end, right? Like, I think I agree with pretty much everything you said. You know, there's a ton of use cases where it doesn't make sense for you to like integrate that, and we should like shove it down your throat. But like, what's the right framing? How should we approach this if we wanted to get people like you to like yeah, just see it as a tool and like not feel like you need to join the cult, basically.
I mean, I feel like it's generally on that path. These things have to start with enthusiasts, the hardcore, just because there's so much hard work to even bring the pipes even close to the surface. I think it's just maybe the next meta, the next era of crypto is about, to use Venkat's term, it's like the vibes mobile. It's the last mile period. And the rails and primitives are very sophisticated. You can chain things together to do a lot, but if it's all built around in network, in crypto applications, people aren't going to care. If it doesn't provide consumer protection, people are going to be afraid and they're going to be right. Like, I think public sentiment is generally correct on things. Like there's some instinctive feeling we have, and people feel this is weird and dangerous. And it kind of is. It kind of is. For some of us, that's the fun. For other people, that's like, man, my life is hard enough, busy enough already. So I think it's maybe it's just good SDKs. It's libraries that are very basic. It's things that touch that surface level and allow someone to do what Metalabel is doing and construct a bespoke application that doesn't feel onerous and it just feels value positive. And I'm not pessimistic about the future of crypto or blockchains. Like I can't imagine a world where it goes away or stops. But I, as a business owner, I, as a creative person, I also just recognize that I can't build my life on it. It is just fundamentally misaligned and right now. And so in the future, does that change? I fully expect it will. And when we looked in the mirror last fall, we were preparing to launch Metalabel as a fully on-chain platform, and my gut said, this is not going to succeed. This is not going to work. But if we were to do it in a way that no one's having to ask, do I feel comfortable with crypto, but it's just simply about releasing work with their friends, like a no-brainer to give it a shot. And I think when blockchain tools reach that place of like, yeah, I'm comfortable, no-brainer, I think that will happen. And, great projects are starting to do that. How far do they get? We'll see.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thank you so much, Yancey, for your time here today and the wonderful talk. Everybody, we will see you all in 2 weeks for a researcher salon with Kia Krutler on her summer protocols research. Thanks again, and see you next time, everybody.